So hi, I'm going slideless today, which is, I think, just fine. I hope it's just fine. I mean, you're to judge. I'm not to judge. Okay, so this is actually really an appropriate place for me to offer my comments because there was so much to think about in what Jonathan offered us, what Lisa offered us, and what Fred offered us. And in a lot of ways, what I have to say connects very strongly to all three of their presentations. Last June of 18, I had a book published called Anti-Social Media, How Facebook Disconnects Us and Undermines Democracy. It was based on about a year of intensive writing, but 10 years of reading some really mind-blowing social media scholarship that came out of my scholarly community, many of whom are here in the room today. Many of those members are here in the room today. And 20 years of digital media scholarship, many of whom, the contributors to that, are in the room today. And so, of course, I have to specifically thank Wendy for bringing us all here today, but also because her work has been so crucial in giving us fresh ways of viewing these phenomena that we invite into our lives with such thoughtlessness, right, in a way. And that's not always improper, but it's been a truly remarkable couple of decades. If you think about the commercial habits as well as the cultural habits and the political ramifications of what we've just subjected ourselves to, I'm struck by the fact that a few months ago, I spent $800 US to purchase a phone for my 13-year-old daughter and then immediately got in there to limit the amount of time she could use it. Right? I mean, that's just absurd. Like, don't use the thing I just spent $800 on. But hey, that's what good parenting is today. Overspending and then restricting. So, and that's just one example, right? I mean, AirPods last 18 months, and then they are not rechargeable anymore, and you throw them away. Disposable $150 headphones. When you think about the levels of absurdities, about the choices we've made in terms of the ecosystem we have built and allowed to be built around us, it's kind of mind-numbing. But this particular book that I wrote was concerned about the fate of democracy. But I wanted it to be clear. It was written inspired by the election of 2016 in the United States. It was my coping mechanism. It was the only way I could help dig myself out of a malaise, one in which I had pretty much convinced myself that I was fairly useless to the world. So what could I contribute? That's my own personal story, but the real story I wanted to tell was one of global significance. It was not about Donald Trump, although Donald Trump does appear in the book, because I think the challenge and the problem that Facebook offers us is much more significant than that. Now, so the book comes out in June 2016. You might remember just a few months earlier, the New York Times and The Guardian had broken their version of the story of Cambridge Analytica and the ways in which Cambridge Analytica had leveraged Facebook data on 75 million voters to at least purport to manipulate elections, although I'm fairly convinced they did no such thing, but they're very good at selling snake oil. That moment, though, March of 2018, started what has been a year of pretty intense scrutiny of Facebook and of platforms in general. So Facebook and Twitter and YouTube have been subjected to some fairly intense, often extremely good journalistic interrogation, policy interrogation, etc. To which I think a lot of us in this community would say, well, it's about time, right? Where were you in 2007, in 2010, in 2011, in 2012, as we were watching these very phenomena rise, as we noticed the extent to which these companies were monitoring everything we do, everywhere we go, everything we think about, and turning it into not only a very successful advertising platform, but manipulating our ability to understand the world in ways that were potentially dangerous and in some cases actually dangerous. Right? The social media scholarship community knew this, understood it, documented it, published it consistently since at least 2010. Nothing that Cambridge Analytica did that happened mostly in 2014 and 15 surprised anyone in my scholarly community. We had been writing about that since at least 2011 because since 2010, from 2010 to 2015, Facebook had an explicit policy of allowing application developers, including those develop personality quizzes, from not only taking all of the interactive Facebook data from users who agreed to use that application, whether that was a personality quiz or Farmville or Mafia Wars or Words with Friends, but all of the information of all of their friends, which of course cascaded exponentially into many millions of users. So all of those application developers, and there were thousands of them, have data about us just as rich, just as valuable as Cambridge Analytica does. In 2012, the Barack Obama campaign had data on 100 million Americans from Facebook through the same mechanisms that Cambridge Analytica achieved that data. When many of us tried to raise this as a problem in 2012, tried to write op-eds, tried to get reporters interested, we were completely ignored because it didn't match the narrative at the moment, which was that Barack Obama was super savvy, not that his campaign was doing something that is basically troubling, that a head of state would have deep personal information on 100 million constituents, many of whom did not support his political agenda. That's the sort of thing, if you swap out Barack Obama with, say, a president of the United States who doesn't necessarily respect the rule of law, I know it can happen, then you have a much different situation. But again, in 2012, it was almost impossible to get anyone to pay attention to this very phenomenon that everyone freaked out about in 2018. Well, I shouldn't complain too much because by the time my book hit the market in 2018, everyone did care about this stuff. So I benefited, and in a lot of ways I should feel grateful because my community of scholars is finally able to say, we told you so. We finally got through to journalists, to pundits, to policymakers, and to a degree I had never imagined, the public. People sort of get today, or they sort of understand to a remarkable degree, and I'm basing this on the feedback I get in all sorts of forums, that algorithms matter, right? That engagement through social media platforms matters. That there is currently no serious hope for competition to Facebook or Google. That Facebook and YouTube are the chief instruments for recruiting misogynists and racists and terrorists around the world. That we are subject to constant massive surveillance by companies that we are not allowed to understand, not allowed to even challenge. And that this persistent flow of data is essential to making these services profitable and making these services work. Now, of course, scholars were way ahead on all of these issues. So, hey, we could declare victory. I have to say, as an aside, it's kind of annoying at this moment to see scholars who have been working extremely hard for years and years to do careful analyses of many of these phenomenon get ignored in the public sphere and crowded out by quick-hit journalism. And that's happening more and more now that everyone in the journalistic world is finally on to our subject. One recent example, just about 2 months ago, there was a web-based report in which a really excellent reporter spent some time at a company in Phoenix looking at the working conditions of those who do content moderation by contract for Facebook and found, unsurprisingly, again, to anyone in my community, that the people who do this sort of work suffer greatly. They suffer from PTSD, they suffer from depression, They often get swept up in the very ideological storms that they're trying to filter for, that they develop all sorts of maladies, and that there is no support for them, and they are terribly paid. All of those things, in my community, we've known for some time, thanks to the work of Sarah Roberts at UCLA, who has a book coming out in June from Yale University Press called Behind the Screen. Please buy it. Please ask your libraries to buy it. It's an excellent book. It's based on deep ethnography, not just in the United States, but around the world, because this phenomenon of Facebook outsourcing this labor force is much more important outside the United States than inside the United States. But once that report came out on that website, immediately all the other reporters in the tech world caught on to this, said, oh, what an awesome story. This is so important. And nobody gave any credit to Sarah Roberts, who in fact had been instrumental in making that reporter aware of that phenomenon in the first place. So that's just a little aside, but something that I'm constantly upset about. But anyway, we finally got through it, right, to a degree. But be careful what you wish for, because we have so much more work to do. As I've been following these discussions in the public, through journalism mostly, but also through policy circles, I've come to catalog some big issues that they're missing. Some things that, again, we in the social media scholarship community or the digital media scholarship community have been onto for some time. So I want to catalog some of these, if you'll allow me. First of all, it's been clear to us for a long time that the most dominant players in this milieu are Facebook and Google. That's unsurprising, and Facebook and Google have justifiably received most of the attention in the public. But the scale of this, I think, is often not acknowledged in the public. So just to give you some numbers as a way of framing it, currently about 2.3 billion people regularly use Facebook. 2.3 billion. By this time next year, it might be 2.5 billion. There are only 7.5 billion humans on Earth. So by this time next year, a third of them will be Facebook users. That's perfectly reasonable prediction. There are 1.6 billion WhatsApp users. There are 1.2 billion Instagram users. There are about 1.2 billion Facebook Messenger users. I have just listed the four of the 5 largest social media platforms in the world. 4 of the 5 largest social media platforms in the world are all owned by Facebook. So very little matters beyond Facebook, except, of course, YouTube, which has about 1.9 billion users around the world, and that's growing quickly as well. I just don't include YouTube as a social media platform for a variety of reasons that we could get into at Talmudic detail if we wish. Nonetheless, the outlier here, of course, is WeChat. WeChat has about 1.3 billion users around the world. Almost all of them are in the People's Republic of China, although the diaspora also engages with WeChat quite significantly, and that is growing as the diaspora grows, but also people outside of both China and the diaspora are finding reasons to engage with WeChat as well. But WeChat has not had a global strategy, has not offered its service in 110 languages the way that Facebook has. So even though it has that level of penetration and domination in China and a little bit beyond, it doesn't directly compete with Facebook in any serious way, if for no other reason that Facebook is not allowed to compete in China. This global picture is often ignored in our journalistic analyses of Facebook. The pure global domination, the historic level of corporate penetration of our minds and our cultures is beyond anything I can think of, right? It pretty much goes oxygen, water, Facebook, right? I mean, it's a pretty stunning thing to think about 2.3 billion people engaging in any similar activity, let alone one that is as interesting, complex, and potentially dangerous as Facebook. Twitter is often grouped in with Facebook. Twitter is extensively studied, by the way. This is actually a problem in our community, is that Twitter is so much easier to study, as Jonathan will attest, than Facebook. Twitter has allowed itself and is structured in such a way that it's much easier to get interesting data from Twitter than it is from Facebook, and it has been for some time. Twitter has about 300 million users around the world. It's basically flat in growth. It's not growing at any significant rate. So again, 300 million, like a few years ago, that would seem like a pretty big number, but it's really not compared to 2.3 billion people with Facebook. So Twitter is an outlier in this. So I'm not ready to say that Twitter doesn't matter in this system, because it does. It's an essential link in the ecosystem. As Jonathan described, it really is all about a global information ecosystem unlike any we have seen before. Historical analogies do not apply. I spent much of the morning trying to knock one down from a guy who used to work at Facebook who's talking all about how we're just seeing Martin Luther and the printing press all over again. And I was like, please, sir, don't get me started. But look, Twitter matters, 4chan matters, 8chan matters, Reddit matters, Fox News matters, RT matters, but they all matter in the ways that they funnel information and expression and memes between and among each other, how they send things up the chain, and how ultimately the global engines of Facebook and YouTube amplify them or choose not to at a global level, right? At a level unlike any of the other outlets. So they're not unimportant parts of the ecosystem, but they are not dominant parts of the ecosystem. Getting a full picture of that, I think, is something that's really important for us to express to our students, to the public, to journalists, to policymakers. That this is a much more interesting ecological system than we tend to grasp as we talk about this. Now here's another thing that really gets me going. The second problem I've seen in the dominant discussions of the effects of Facebook, especially Facebook, but Facebook and YouTube around the world, is that it is not a US problem, it is not a Western Europe problem, it is not a UK problem, it's certainly not a Canadian problem, it's not a North American problem. We all got off easy, right? Donald Trump is nothing compared to some of what we're facing around the world through these systems. If you look deeply, and this is what I wish people would do, look deeply at Myanmar, look deeply at Sri Lanka, at the Philippines, at Cambodia, at Pakistan, at Nigeria, at Kenya, at Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Estonia, and Italy, you will see some similarities, but you will see deep differences in each of these sites. Deep differences in how people use these platforms. Deep differences in the political and economic and technological environments that were already present before Facebook and YouTube and WhatsApp showed up. And so each of these countries, and even within each of these countries, you have a very distinct individual story that is not being told because we are so focused on Brexit and on Trump and on the alt-right in the United States. And while we do see flashes when there is a mass murder in Sri Lanka, we pay attention for about 72 hours. And we get the most facile debates about whether it was proper for the Sri Lankan government to flip the switch on Facebook and WhatsApp, as if they haven't been flipping the switch on every other distribution of media outside of their control for more than 20 years, right? Complete historical and cultural and political ignorance reigned in that short discussion we had for about 72 hours. It drives me nuts, it should drive you nuts, that we can't have a deeper discussion about how particular places in the world are subject to particular phenomena and interact with these services in similar and just as importantly different ways. And that there is no one-size-fits-all prescription for addressing the maladies in each of these areas. Right? There has been Russian-inspired propaganda distributed through Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp in Ukraine and in Estonia, but Ukraine and Estonia are very different places. And so this propaganda has been received in very different ways in Ukraine and Estonia. So to even compare the two doesn't make much sense, given the very different histories of those two countries. And then, of course, there are the big ones, the big three, which remain terribly understudied. India, Brazil, and Indonesia. These are three sites that could not be more complex and fascinating. Now again, for about a month last summer, we had a lot of coverage about the Bolsonaro movement and the ways in which he was deploying WhatsApp to spread propaganda. It didn't have deep analysis. It didn't talk about the ways in which WhatsApp was connected to other media forms. It didn't talk about the role of Globo, the most dominant broadcast media form in Brazil, and the ways in which Bolsonaro was explicitly challenging Globo in this. All of those stories fell out of the complexity, and it became just another authoritarian using WhatsApp to achieve electoral victory, and nothing specific about Brazil, or for that matter, specific about Bolsonaro, made it to our analysis. It was all a technological, deterministic story that we got in the United States, not unlike the uprisings of the spring of 2011 and how shallowly they were presented to us, again, without any recognition of the role of labor or football clubs or Al Jazeera or any of that in the story, right? Indonesia, I think one of the most interesting countries in the world anyway, because it's so multilingual, has such a fascinating post-colonial history, such a remarkably tumultuous political history over the last 40 years. And the role of social media platforms in Indonesia is ignored completely by any sort of mainstream analysis. Every once in a while, something blows up in one of these parts of the world, and we get, as I said, 48 to 72 hours of attention. So those big three, we definitely need more research done on them, more sophisticated, more on-the-ground research, the kind of research that Lisa Parks is inspiring. So again, we all got off easy in this part of the world. On the list of things that we're getting wrong, or that the public discussion is getting wrong, is the concept of privacy. First of all, that word seems to miss the mark. It's so easily applied to things that don't quite matter, right? So Mark Zuckerberg, for instance, in the last 3 months, has gone a long way to conflate privacy and security. He wants us to believe that the application of end-to-end encryption in his messaging services is somehow a privacy protection for us. And so he wants us to believe that that is both sufficient and essential. And yet he has done nothing to address the very relationship that his services have with the users of those services and that process of constant surveillance. So our data flow relationships with Facebook has not changed and will not change at all, but Zuckerberg wants us to believe that the installation of end-to-end encryption in direct messaging on Instagram is somehow some impressive improvement. And so we could all go a long way to help complicate the notion of privacy, as if it's not complicated enough. Beyond that, we have to emphasize that when we talk about the level of pollution on Facebook, on YouTube, often we revert to terribly inappropriate phrases like fake news, which implies, first of all, that there is some level of authenticity we should be seeking with the content that is distributed on these services, and, just as importantly, that it is fact claims that matter more than affective positions. Now again, scholars know better, right? Scholars know that affect matters more than fact claims in many of these situations. And that we're not just talking about political affiliations, political positions, political candidates, political movements, or hate-based movements for that matter. We're talking about affiliation and identity. That people will choose to promote certain forms of content, certain messages, as an expression of who they are, who they want to be, as a way of affiliating with a larger group or a larger movement, regardless, again, of the fact-based claims or the grounding of those claims. That it's a very different process than what we have been told. And so fact-checking, as Jonathan pointed out, misses the point entirely. misses the point entirely. Beyond that, education. There's been a flurry of conversation about the essential role that education can play in having us recover from these maladies. Again, education misses the point. Fundamentally, 15-year-olds are not the problem in the world. 50-year-olds are the problem in the world. Emphasizing education as an appropriate response to this phenomenon puts the burden on teachers. It puts the burden on students. It essentially puts the burden and the blame on those who are victimized by these phenomena. It ignores the power of algorithms. It ignores the explicit campaigns launched by certain forces around the world to distribute noxious materials. It ignores everything that's really happening and everything that's important, and assumes that we can train people, and young people, to filter for themselves sense from nonsense, and that will somehow achieve an improved ecosystem. Well, in my book and in my discussion since the book came out, I've come to a very uncomfortable conclusion. And that conclusion is that Facebook is unfixable. And that this ecological problem is fundamentally unfixable as of today. And the one word that drives me crazy, the word I wish I would never hear in these discussions, is solution. Solution is the wrong word. It's a terrible word. It implies, first of all, that there is a single cause, or even a set of simple and identifiable causes, that it's not about a historical moment, it's not about an ideological moment, that it's not about a long story. It implies that it's about a particular technology or suite of technologies, and that we might just be able to build another technology to fix the problems that the last technology caused. That sort of fundamentalism got us in this place in the first place. That sort of fundamentalism has hope embodied in it, though, right? It's a very American idea, by the way. This notion that we can fix things, that we can build the next thing, right? Hey, we got to the moon long ago, right? So we can do anything. But in fact, that's the wrong way to approach this. There are three aspects to Facebook that matter, that define Facebook. Three aspects of Facebook that make Facebook Facebook. First is its scale, 2.3 billion people constantly adding content and connecting with other people at every second of the day in more than 110 languages. So any proposal to reform Facebook or address the problems of Facebook that ignores 2.3 billion people in 110 languages is inadequate, is comical in a sense. Again, that scale is awesome, and we cannot forget it. The second thing that makes Facebook Facebook is algorithmic amplification. The idea that Facebook chooses for us what we see in our timelines. Facebook chooses it based on what it predicts will generate response, engagement, clicks, shares, likes, and comments, especially comments. Facebook has learned over time what sort of content generates lots of engagement, and Facebook amplifies those particular pieces of content. Unsurprisingly, again, to those who study this stuff, it is affect that matters. The things that gather engagement are the things that create strong emotional reactions, like baby pictures and puppy pictures and calls to genocide and hate speech. Things that generate strong reactions. And nonsense. The more absurd your claim, the stronger the reaction. If you were to go onto Facebook today and put up something absurd, something crazy, something harmful, most of the response, I would hope, from your Facebook friends would be negative. People would try to correct you, would lead you to a perhaps a better source. And all of that interaction would amplify that content even more, which is why you can't argue with the crazy on Facebook. And then the third aspect of Facebook is the advertising system, which depends on that constant surveillance. That advertising system has fueled a tremendously profitable enterprise, and its profits are something we cannot ignore. It's the source of its political power. So even though it's dealing with a lot of political flack and feedback around the world, it is ultimately invulnerable because of its wealth. That's what we're going to see soon enough. In addition, the advertising system crowds out so many other forms of expression that depends on advertising. So basically, you can't fix any of this situation without addressing those core things: scale, algorithmic amplification, and the advertising system, the three things that make Facebook Facebook, which is why I say the problem with Facebook is Facebook. So that's depressing, and it doesn't get us anywhere. But here's my trick. My trick is, first of all, that somewhere out there, somebody's reading my stuff, or some audience that I'm speaking to has a bunch of smart people smarter than myself, who say, you know what, you're reading it wrong. You got it wrong. Your analysis is wrong, and I'm going to show you. Because if sometime over the next 5 or 10 or 20 years, if we have that long, those people who are smarter than myself, maybe my students, maybe your students, are going to come up with responses, not solutions, but responses that might dull the edges of this system, that might correct for some of the negative externalities, that might save a few lives down the line. But that's not happening soon. And I think it's a big mistake to try to minimize the level of damage that Facebook and Google have done in the world, or at least have contributed to. But basically, one of the reasons that we don't have proper responses is we don't yet know enough. Because our community of social media scholars, despite 10 years of amazing work, digital media, 20 years of amazing work, has been underfunded, largely ignored, and we've gone about our business quite happy with our ability to create a new field, which doesn't happen very often. And we've done a remarkable success, and we're justifiably proud of ourselves for doing it. But there is so much more that we don't understand. So many more studies we have to do on the ground in places around the world where the story is very unlike what we see in the United States or in Western Europe or in Canada. We have to look at so many issues that we haven't even started to predict. So we have a lot more work to do, which means that we actually have a political agenda. We should have a political agenda to promote our work in such a way that justifies higher levels of funding for our work, because the work we do is so crucial. So I'm going to leave you with that, and maybe we can get into it more in the question and answer. Thank you very much.